Our phone rang last night, and it was Kim calling from Florida to say he was praying for me and for our time together, that it would be a blessing, and I appreciated him doing that. And it's indicative of a man with a shepherd's heart. He was thinking about you while he's in Florida, and we talked a little bit, and then he wanted to tell me about the weather down there. I said, I'd rather not talk about that. And then he had the audacity to tell me he got sunburned a little bit yesterday. Now, it was good to hear from him, and I did want to publicly commend the elders for their thoughtfulness and their kindness to Kim and Janet, because as you know, just recently they were heading for Florida, and then Janet's mother was ill and unexpectedly died, and their trip was delayed and canceled, really, and the elders decided to, rather than lose their trip to Florida to visit his parents, that they went ahead and gave him that time. So that's why I'm up here, and I think that was very nice of them to do that. So, and I hope you'll bear with me being up on this platform. Standing down there, you wouldn't see me, and I wouldn't see you. So I thought it'd be better if I was up here. And I can't see the clock back there, so that's a problem. I don't wear a watch. And I'm like the grandmother who brought her little granddaughter to church one day, and just before the sermon, the preacher took his watch off and laid it down there, and the little girl said, "Grandma, what does that mean?" She said, "It doesn't mean anything." I'll do my best to be done in 25 minutes. Is that all right? That's shorter than a game show on TV. So. Well, you may already know this, but just in case you don't, I must tell you that it doesn't matter who you are, where you live, what you do for a living, or how good you are or think you are. It also doesn't matter whether you're tall or short, rich or poor, well-educated or uneducated. You will not be spared, because what the poet says is true. Everyone has problems in this restless world of care. Everyone grows weary with the cross they have to bear. Everyone is troubled, and our skies are overcast as we try to face the future while dwelling on the past. So while the problems that perplex us keep growing every day, and we vainly try to solve them in our own self-serving way, God knows exactly what He's doing, and He works to make us free, and He wants to use our problems to make us what we're meant to be. In this world, problems are universal and also unavoidable. And what we desperately need to know is how they can also be profitable. Our problem sometimes with problems is that, more likely than not, we resent them rather than rejoice in them, as James tells us to do when he says, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers, whenever you face trials of various kinds." We could read that, "whenever you experience problems of various kinds." The Good News Version translates that verse a little bit differently and says, "My brothers, consider yourselves fortunate when all kinds of trials or troubles or problems come your way." Now my question is this: why in the world would we choose to consider ourselves fortunate when we're faced with all kinds of problems and trials and difficulties and frustrations? Well, humanly speaking, it just doesn't make any sense. But if we're willing to step back a little bit and look at life from God's perspective, it will be possible to have a positive attitude toward our problems and our frustrations, our difficulties, if we're able to understand that God has a purpose for them and in them. Listen to the rest of that admonition given by the Apostle James. He says, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith develops perseverance. Perseverance must finish its work, so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything." So did you hear what he said about why we can choose to consider it pure joy when we're facing difficulties, problems, and trials? He says we can do that because we know something. We know something that other people don't know. So this is a choice not made emotionally or blindly. It can be made intelligently and objectively. We know something, and the something we know is that God has a purpose in our problems. God has a purpose in our problems. And that purpose is that if we cooperate with Him, He can use them to make us mature and complete, not lacking in anything when it comes to our Christian character. The key thought here is that God can and will use our problems to help us if we cooperate with Him. Now that's a really big if, isn't it? If we cooperate with Him. If we don't cooperate with Him, then He can't work in us. So what we want to know, and what we need to know, is how can we cooperate with God when we're struggling with a difficulty, a problem, a frustration, a trial, whatever it might be. How can we cooperate? Well, in my opinion, one of the primary ways we can do that is by trying to understand what He might be doing with the problem that we're experiencing. And all I want to do this morning is to suggest some ways, some options that we ought to consider when we're going through a difficult time, what God may intend it to do for us. Some options. Now, if you looked at your outline, and I hope you do, and I hope you write the words down, because if you're like me, you'll forget, but writing them down helps a little bit. And you may have looked there, and there's 5. And you say, oh my goodness, 5 points? We won't get out of here until Tuesday. But, we will. And I'll go fairly fast, because I'm from Pennsylvania, and I can talk really fast. In fact, I can talk faster than you can listen. So here it is. These are some ways we can look at our problems and see what God might be doing in the midst of those problems. So listen to this verse and see if you can figure out what the word is that goes in the outline. Jeremiah chapter 10, the prophet is speaking, and he says this, I know, O Lord, that a man's life is not his own. It is not for man to direct his steps. So did you hear that? He says it is not for man to direct his steps. And if it's not for man to direct his steps, then it must be for God to direct our steps. But how does He direct them? Well, He could do so in a variety of ways, but I'm suggesting in this sermon that one of the ways God directs our steps is by using our problems to direct us. And that's the word that goes in your outline. Problems direct us. Okay? Now, for instance, sometimes we decide to go in a specific direction. And we all do this at different times in our life. We decide to go in a specific direction, and we set out on our journey only to run into what appears to be an unsolvable problem. The problem actually becomes an obstacle, and we just can't seem to get past it. Now, does that sound like any stories you've heard in the Bible? In the Old Testament especially? Well, it's one of my favorite stories. It's about Balaam. Remember the prophet Balaam? To make a long story short, the king of Moab wanted to pay Balaam to curse the Israelites so that Moabites could defeat them in battle. Well, God, of course, didn't want Balaam to do that. So in chapter 22, just write the note down there if you want to the chapter. Don't turn to it if you will. In Numbers chapter 22 it says this, Balaam got up in the morning, early in the morning, saddled his donkey and went with the princes of Moab. But God was very angry when he went, and the angel of the Lord stood in the road to oppose him. Balaam was riding on his donkey, and his 2 servants were with him. When the donkey saw the angel of the Lord standing in the road with a drawn sword in his hand, she turned off the road into the field. Balaam beat her to get her back on the road. Now there's a pattern here you're going to see. Then the angel of the Lord stood in a narrow path between 2 vineyards, with walls on both sides. When the donkey saw the angel of the Lord, she pressed close to the wall, crushing Balaam's foot against it. So he beat her again. Then the angel of the Lord moved on ahead and stood in the narrow place where there was no room to turn either to the right or the left. When the donkey saw the angel of the Lord, she lay down under Balaam, and guess what? And it says, and Balaam was very angry, and he beat her with his staff. I've often thought I wouldn't mind being one of Balaam's servants, but I sure wouldn't want to be his donkey. Balaam definitely had a problem, didn't he? But what he didn't know was, even though the problem was of his own making, God was intervening to use it to direct him away from certain death to himself. It wasn't until the donkey was miraculously made to speak that Balaam understood God was using this problem to help him by directing him away from death. I like the way the Good News Version translates Proverbs chapter 20, verse 30. It says this: sometimes it takes a painful experience to make us change our ways. Isn't that true? I hear one moan. It almost sounded like an amen. So let me just say this. The next time you're dealing with a problem that's causing you pain, at least consider the possibility that God might be using it to direct you away from harm to yourself or to someone else. And I might add, don't wait for a donkey to speak before you consider that option. So along with using our problems to direct us, God is also able to use them to inspect us. And that's the second point in the outline. And once again, I want to admit to you that this is kind of a new idea to me. I've only learned a few things in the last couple of years that I didn't know. After 50 years of preaching, you think you knew everything, but that's when you decide you know everything, that's when you don't know anything. And in the last couple of years or 3 years, I've learned some things. And this idea of God using our problems to inspect us is one I had never given much thought to. I kind of knew that God inspects us, but I didn't know how. And this idea came to me through someone else, and I thought, that makes a lot of sense. Now, all you have to do is read the Scriptures and know that God is intensely interested in what's going on inside of us. He wants to know. In fact, Jeremiah chapter 17, verse 10, God is speaking, and it's speaking of him, and he says, I, the Lord, search the heart and examine the mind. He's doing that. And then these words from Job chapter 7, verses 17 and 18, and they're from the Good News Version. And I like the Good News Version. It's very simple, and it's very understandable. It's a good one. But anyway, it says, Job is speaking, and he asks God, he says, why is man so important to you? Why do you pay attention to what he does? You inspect him every morning. See the word? You inspect him every morning. So why would God want to inspect his children every morning? Well, I suspect that he might inspect us daily, just as a shepherd does his sheep. And Jack referred to the great shepherd a minute ago. And why do shepherds inspect their sheep daily? They want to see how they're growing, that they're healthy, and that they're growing properly and spiritually. And I think one of the best places in life for him to check us out, to inspect us in our maturity department, is the way we handle our problems and difficulties. Problems are kind of like tests that you take in school, aren't they? I vaguely remember going to school. And some of you still know what it's like because you're there. But problems and difficulties and frustrations and troubles are like a test that we take in school. And the way we handle them shows whether we're learning anything, whether we're growing spiritually or not. And if we solve our problems, if we deal with our difficulties the same way non-believers do, by relying on our own wisdom or depending on our own strength, it reveals a weakness in our relationship to God, and that gives him an opportunity to teach us to trust him even more. If we could just learn to look at our problems as opportunities for growing spiritually, rather than obstacles to feeling good emotionally, they would be much less disturbing and much more rewarding than they are now. How different our attitudes and our actions would be if we considered ourselves fortunate when we're confronted with a problem or a difficulty, as James says we should do. It's just looking at things differently than we do. So now we know what? 2 ways God can use our problems. One, to do what? Boy, Daryl was right. You can't see a thing up here. I know you're out there, and probably you should move a couple times so I'll know you're there. So, anyway, we know that God can use our problems to direct us and to inspect us. Okay? To increase our appreciation for our problems even more, the author of the book of Hebrews teaches us that God can also use our problems to correct us. That's the word that goes in the outline, to correct us. Listen, if you will, to Hebrews chapter 12, and see if you don't agree that on some occasions, God's purpose in our problems, now I'm talking not about causation, but utilization. God is not causing our problems, He's utilizing them to help us grow. You see the point? All right, I hope so. That's a big thought there. This is from the Contemporary English Version. It's maybe one you're not used to, but it's a very interesting version anyway. But verse 6 says, "Be patient when you are being corrected. This is how God treats His children. Don't all parents correct their children?" What's that? That's a rhetorical question, isn't it? It's expecting a yes answer. Don't all parents correct their children? God corrects all of His children, and if He doesn't correct you, then you really don't belong to Him. So, the author of the book of Hebrews is arguing that God's correction is proof that we are His children, and that it is evidence that He loves us. Unfortunately, correction is usually painful, isn't it? We don't like to be corrected. For that reason, we tend to resent it rather than be thankful for it. But if correction is a confirmation that we are a child of God, the question then is, what form does that correction take? Well, once again, there's not a simple answer to this. There's many forms that the correction can take. But for this sermon, I'm suggesting that God can correct us through our problems to help us grow. I'll give you an example. Sometimes He can correct us through emotional distress, which some of you know I go through when I have to preach. When I should say get to preach, yes. Or through physical discomfort. And God can cause that in our life. And the example I have is David, when David had committed adultery with Bathsheba and also murdering her husband. In Psalm 32, David says, "When I kept silent," in other words, when I didn't acknowledge what I had done, when I didn't confess it, when I kept silent, my bones wasted away through my groaning all day long. For night and day your hand was heavy upon me, and my strength was sapped as in the heat of summer." You see the picture? God's hand was heavy on David, pressing down on his conscience to help him move in the direction he should go. So in His mercy, God corrected His sinful servant by putting constant emotional and physical pressure on him. Now listen to this closely. Because God loved David so much, He wouldn't leave him alone. Have you ever felt like you wish God would just leave you alone? He doesn't, because He loves you. And He loved David so much. David had done a terrible, terrible thing. He had committed a crime worthy of death. And if he didn't deal with it properly, it would eventually kill him, not only spiritually, but physically. So how did God correct him? Well, in my opinion, He did so by simply allowing him to feel the full force of the problem that he had created by the crimes of adultery and murder. God actually used the problem to correct His wayward servant by forcing him to deal with it in a way that would bring him back to himself. And that's exactly what David did. Listen to what he says. What it says right after he says that he was keeping silent. In verse 5 he says, "Then I acknowledged my sin to you and did not cover up my iniquity. I said," quote, "I will confess my transgressions to the Lord, and you forgave the guilt of my sin." So do you see what happened? God used the problem that David created by his sin to push him into a place that he was so uncomfortable that the only way he could get relief from his pain was to confess his transgression. That's a good thing. We talked in our class about denial and repression and those things. When we're guilty and we don't want to face it, sometimes God will let us get into a corner where we have to face it and deal with it and let Him work with us. If you consider the timing very closely involved in David's sin, you'll discover that almost a whole year passed from the time that David committed adultery and caused her husband to be murdered. Almost a whole year passed before he dealt with it. All that time, David was suffering immensely because he did not deal with the conditions that he created. So God pushed him into a place where he would admit it and confess it and grow in it. So that's the example in that case. Now, another one, you ready?
Yes.
Somebody. I used to say, in other places I could see, but it's hard to hear. I used to say, if you're ready, just shake your head, but I can't see your head. So you'll have to do something verbally. Okay, so we know that our problems can be used by God if we cooperate with Him. He can use them to direct us, to inspect us, to correct us, but also God can use our problems to protect us. That's the word that goes in the outline, protect us. Now, I have to admit to you that when I first learned of this use that God can make of our problems, I did not fully comprehend it, and I'm not sure I do now. But maybe, just maybe, as we talk about it together, God's Spirit will help us better understand it. I think one of the most precious promises that God has made to His people is that He will protect us. Do you agree? He will protect us. Psalm 91, verse 14 in the Good News Version says, God says, I will save those who love me, and will protect those who know me as Lord. When they call to me, I will answer them. When they are in trouble, I will be with them. And that's the idea of the problem. I'm in trouble, all right? And I realize that he doesn't use the word problem there, but problems usually involve trouble, and trouble involves problems, right? And so the idea is there. And let me give you an example. Some of you are going to know this right off. Do you remember Jacob's son, Joseph? You know who he is, the 12 brothers? Okay. If you know his story, you know that this young man encountered many, many difficulties and problems in his life. Some of them were so serious that if he failed to handle those problems correctly, it could mean death for him. Now, in my opinion, the worst problem that Joseph had in his life was with the wife of the Egyptian official who owned him. Now, none of us have ever been owned by anybody, but I can't even imagine that. But Joseph was owned. He was a slave. Do you remember this woman? She was a sexual predator. That's what I would call her. She was obsessed with seducing this young Hebrew slave, and she did everything she could to entice him into her bed. It was a terrible, terrible, troubling problem for him. You see, if he gave in to her, he would sin against God and have to suffer the consequences. If he didn't give in to her, she was his owner, and he would have to feel the full force of her wrath. And in the midst of that terrible turmoil, this young man's faithfulness to God allowed the Lord to use that very problem that he was wrestling with to protect him from a greater problem later in his life. You see, by allowing Joseph to deal with this situation, rather than rescuing him from it, God was preparing him to be a ruler in Egypt, second in command to the Pharaoh himself. Think of it. If God had supernaturally delivered young Joseph from this problem, rather than to let him wrestle with it, he most likely would not have learned how to persevere under pressure, or to remain faithful when severely tempted, or to stand firm on his convictions, or to forgive those who treated him unjustly. God knew that it was best for Joseph to struggle in this problem situation. And sometimes that's what we need to do also. We need to struggle with it. And rather than cry out to God to take it away, ask Him to give us the strength to deal with it and do it in an honoring way of Him. And we could say a lot more about that, but it's time to move on to the last one. Are you ready for it?
Yes.
Who said that? That was a little bit too quick. Are you ready? I shouldn't ask if I didn't want to know. Okay, so the final way that I want to suggest that God can use our problems. Do you see the amazing thing about this? The one thing that the world resents and avoids is problems. And you can't do it. Everybody has them. And sometimes we have them just because we're children of God. Problems are created for that reason. But let me say this. Another way that God can use our problems, one that we seldom if ever think about, and because we don't, we miss out on a lot of really good opportunities to grow spiritually and to learn. What I'm talking about is that in the process of helping us become all He wants us to be, God can and does use our problems to perfect us. That's the word that goes in the outline, to perfect us. Let me give you a verse that I think verifies what I just said. And then I'll give you a quick example, practical example, and we're done. All right? Again, this is from the Good News Version, 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 10. Peter says, after you have suffered a little while, the God of all grace, who calls you to share in his eternal glory in union with Christ, he will himself perfect you. See? Will himself perfect you and give you firmness, strength, and a sure foundation. Hey, that sounds like something we've heard before. Haven't we? Foundation. Peter says that God himself will perfect them and also us. And by that he means that at some point, God will make all of us completely and exactly what he wants us to be. In other words, he'll finish all the work in us that he plans and will be everything he always meant us to be. The question is, what part does our problems play in this perfecting process? Well, my answer is, and what I've been learning is this, that as we solve our problems in a God-honoring way, we work with God in that perfecting process, in that sanctifying process. Let me give you one example, and then we're done. These are words from the Apostle Paul, great words. I live by these words. In fact, I've been living by these words for the last 5 years, very personally. Paul says, for me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. If I am to go on living in the body, this will mean fruitful labor for me. Yet, what shall I choose? I do not know. I am torn between the two. I desire to depart and be with Christ, which is better by far, but it is more necessary for you that I remain in the body. The problem that Paul has is in the form of a dilemma. You ever been in a dilemma? On the one hand, he wants to die, not just to die to escape earth. He wants to die so he can be with Christ, which he says is far better. And yet, on the other hand, he feels this need to stay alive so he can help those he loves. This is an extremely difficult problem to deal with. But notice how he resolves it. He chooses to let the Lord decide for him between the two options. And once he decides to let the Lord choose for him, he says this, and I quote, I know that I will remain and will continue with all of you for your progress and the joy in the faith, and your joy in the faith. Now, what I'm saying is that when we come to a place in our life that we're willing to let the Lord resolve our problems in a way that honors him, we are allowing him to use those very problems to perfect us and help us become what he wants us to be. So, the conclusion is that the next time you find yourself dealing with a difficulty, a troublesome problem, a frustrating situation, I think it would be wise to consider the possibility that God's purpose in that situation may be to direct you, it may be to inspect you, it may be to correct you, it may be to protect you, and certainly it is to perfect you. One of those possibilities, and maybe more than one in any given situation. Now, as we close, I want to remind you that the greatest problem anyone will ever face in this life is where he or she spends eternity. And it's amazing to me that when you solve the greater problem, you solve the lesser one. Isn't it? Once you know where you're going to spend eternity, many of the other problems kind of fade away and they're not so big. So I'm just saying to you, if you're here this morning and you have not yet resolved that problem in your life, if you don't know where you're going to spend eternity, this would be a good time to decide as we sing our invitation. And I don't know what that is. You've been very good listeners, and I appreciate that. And I trust that as we make decisions in life, we'll do them in a way that honors God. Let's stand.